Thanks very much to Colette and Catherine and Marisha for inviting me and all their help organising everything to get me here. Bore ki a croeso, so good morning everyone and welcome. So my name's Dawn, I'm based in Cardiff University and I've been using visual methods in my research since my master's degree, and I'll talk more about that as we go through the day. So, there's quite a lot to cover. I've got 106 slides, not to scare you. So, the beginning part is quite a lot of me talking, and then the activities will come in. So it's quite a bit of a heavy morning, but then as we go through the day, there'll be less talking and more interaction and more of you making things. Because I think it's really important if you want to use visual and creative methods, or any methods really with other people, that you trial them on yourselves first. Otherwise you're asking them to do something that you haven't done and you don't know what it feels like. So I think any visual methods you use, you should try. And try with other people and friends and colleagues before you go out with participants. So what we're going to cover today is think about the three main types of visual research. So visual research with found materials, so things that already exist, the researcher creating visual materials, and participants creating them. So there are blurred boundaries between those, but there are three main types. Then we're going to look at the familiarity issue, which is an issue across health and social science research. So thinking about how do we make the familiar strange? How do we investigate topics that we know about without them being overshadowed by what we already know and our assumptions? And how the visual can help with that. We're then going to have a focus on participatory methods, and you're going to do a mapping activity yourselves. So we've got pens and papers and things at the back. We're then going to think a lot about ethics. So ethics are really important in research, but they have particular issues with visual research, particularly if it's film or photograph. So we'll look at those issues. And then lastly, we're going to think about revisualization, which I think is really important. And that's about how do you get messages out. So often when you do your lit review, you'll find there's a problem, and there was a problem 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 40 years ago. And when you get your findings, they're exactly the same findings. Because people are finding these things, but things aren't changing in policy and practice. And one of the reasons for this is because we just churn out long and boring reports and journal articles that nobody wants to read if they're a busy practitioner. So it's thinking, what else could we do and what else might have an impact? Okay. So, visual methods go across disciplines and across schools and across topics. So there isn't a topic or discipline that couldn't use visual methods. And part of the strength of visual methods is when people combine that work and work interdisciplinary ways. What I'd do if I had a smaller group when I run these sessions is that I would have asked people to bring in an object, and I've only got about 15 people, but there were too many coming today for me to do that. But object work's quite nice because if you get people to bring something from home which says something about them, it's a nice way to learn about people. You can sort of go around the room. So we haven't got time to do that this morning, but hopefully there'll be time in the breaks and the lunches to have a chat and meet other people and see what they're doing in their work. Okay. I should also say, because I'm from Cardiff, when we start talking, it all goes a bit Cardiff Arms Park, and it goes quicker and quicker. So if I do go quicker and quicker, or you can't understand me, do say, slow down, we don't know what you're saying. If I'm saying something and you want any clarification or you've got a question, do feel free to interrupt. You don't have to wait until the end. So if I say something and you want to know more about it or you want to check something, let me know. Okay, so Luke Powell's offers this sort of framework for classifying visual information. That's from the Sage Handbook of Research Methods, which I've just done the second edition with him. He did the first edition with Eric Margolis, who's retired now. But it's quite a nice book, and it's probably in your libraries because it sort of covers everything. So the first edition had about 40 chapters, The new edition, when that comes out at the end of the year, will have 45. So it's sort of handbook that covers lots and lots of approaches. So he talks about found materials, where the social scientist is just collecting things that are already there to be found. So they're looking out in the world and they're bringing these things together. Then the researcher initiated, when you make your own things. And then participatory productions, where you're facilitating other people to make things alone or with you. But you're moving hopefully some of the power in research to them. But there are blurred lines between all these three, which you'll see. So found materials can be anything. They can be anything from works of art to heritage sites, to advertising, to print media. So we're surrounded by this vast, huge amount of visual materials, and they all tell us something. So even something as benign as a McDonald's wrapper tells you lots of different things. So if you look at children in America, they're more likely to recognise the McDonald's sign than a picture of Jesus. So what icons visually tell what stories, and what do they tell us about particular cultures? So found materials are always really interesting to look at, and also really easy to find, because we are surrounded by them. And often when we do a review of the literature, we look at what's been written, but we don't always look at the images. But if you are researching a particular population, you might want to see how are they represented? How are that population visually represented in the media? How do they look? Gillian Rose, if you're interested in visual methods and you're going to continue with visual methods, Gillian Rose wrote that Visual Methodologies book, which is now in its 4th or 5th edition. And it was one of the first books I read, Gillian Rose and Marcus Banks as well. So Gillian Rose has done lots and lots of work, and she's based in human geography, but it's definitely worth reading her work. This is from her 2nd book, where she looked at images of the missing and the dead after the London bombings. And she looked in particular at how the press used particular images to create a particular type of audience. So what you see in a lot of the images, you see these images as destruction, but they're often paired with other things like symbols of Englishness or Britishness, like the red letterboxes, or they're pictured with flags, so that it tells this story of destruction, but also national pride, unification. So photographs were taken in a very particular way. She also looked at the way that photographs of the missing and the dead were used, and how family photographs then became news images, and what that means. So what does it mean for you to have your family pictured and repictured and recirculated in the news? So here you've got a visual analysis of found images, and here Gillian just looks at the images themselves. So she doesn't talk to photographers, she doesn't talk to the families. It's just a concentration on the images. She also looks at how the men that planted the bombs were represented, and how they were represented as dehumanised or less than human, with particular images. Gillian Rose has also done work with family photographs, and family photographs fell out of favour in visual research because there was an argument that they can't tell us anything. Because if you look at anyone's family photographs, which are on the wall or in frames or in albums, they're like this. They're not giving a real picture of family life, they're giving a particular performance of family life. My daughter put something on Facebook the other day, and she had, it was my daughter and her grandchildren there, and they look really like this. But her partner had taken another photo when they were all fighting, and then he'd sort of said, this is what we pretend, and this is what it's really like, this is the real version. So family photographs often look like this. So there's an idea, what can you learn? But Gillian argues you can still learn something, because photographs aren't just about what's produced. It's about the materiality of the photograph. Who is it used? Who's it shared with? Why is it taken? So with the family photographs, she didn't just analyse them. She talked to the people who'd taken them. So she talked to women who'd taken photographs and about why they take them, and about this idea to have this acceptable form of a maternal subject that has pictures of their children, about who does the work of that. So who has to collate the photographs? Who sends the photographs to the mother-in-law? Who does all that work with photographs? So with the photographs, what you can see and the face value of them is only part of their story. So often it's useful to not just look at the found images as they are, but to think about who created them and why, and who views them and why. Janet Fink and Helen Lomax have also done some lovely work, both with found images and creating images. And in this study, they're particularly interested in how children and children living in poverty are presented and how it changes over time. So the original image that they looked at is the Gorbals boys, so Bert Hardy's photograph. And Bert Hardy at the time said that he was exposing people to what it's really like to live in marginalised areas in Glasgow. So that was his aim. And at the time, the images of the boys were read as troubling and as troublemakers. So when the photographs were first released, the boys were sort of demonised and seen as bad and they should be controlled. When people look at the photograph years later, you get this romanticised discourse about children could play out in the street and there were less cars and they had more freedom and wasn't this great. So it's exactly the same image and exactly the same boys, but it has a different discourse. The other images she looks at are these Jeff J. Mitchell's images of the Govan boys, and they're interesting because they've been used so many times. So it comes from a series of images, but that image has been used, I think, probably about 7,000 times by now in different print articles. What's really interesting about that image is it's used to tell two different political stories. So sometimes the image is used in more right-wing press to argue that the UK is being spoilt by families who are feral and don't look after their children and don't look after their neighbourhoods, and something should be done about them. And it's used by left-wing media to argue that the state is failing families. So you again, it's exactly the same image, exactly the same boys, but two different stories told. And two little boys in the middle of it. So here you can only see the backs of the boys' head. In other photos you can see their faces. So they become this symbol of marginalised childhood. So again, you can see how images are used and reused to tell different stories. So Gillian Rose argues that visual images are never innocent. We always have to think about who created them, why did they create them, how are they being read and reread in different ways, and also things like how is it positioned. So with this image, it looks like two little boys are on their own because the camera fixes it. You could have two little boys on their own and you could have a mum with a pushchair saying stop running into the gardens. You could have one house that is derelict and boarded up, but you could have a whole street of lovely houses, but we can't see that. We can only see what's in the frame, and that's the danger of photographs. So we can think about photographs as found images, but when we talk to the people that created them and do other work with them, that blurs the line. So they're not simply analysis of something you find, you get different accounts. The second section in Luke's categories is researcher initiated. And probably a lot of you do that in your work already, even if you haven't used visual methods, because it's things like diagrams and maps that you often see in reports. So visual illustrations are often used to get a point over and a point across. It also stems from things like documentary photography, so that seeded social science interest in photographs. So you've got photographs and maps. You might also have things like street art, which give particular messages over. So researchers create images themselves. That has some advantages on using found images, because if you create the image yourself, you know why you created it. You know what wasn't in the frame. You know all that contextualised seeing information that you don't know if you just find an image. So when you're creating your own images and own photographs, you know more about the process. In the social sciences, most of the work is really traced to anthropological work. So earlier imperialism, where photography was used in this colonial project. So if you think about who could take photographs, only particular people. So mostly men who were white, lots of money, because otherwise you wouldn't have a camera. So if you weren't very rich, you would not have early camera equipment. You couldn't afford to travel and represent other people. So our history that we know through photographs comes from a very set perspective of a particular class of people. So what you find with this early photography is that you get this reductive realism. So early photography and anthropology was often used to control other nations and make this hierarchical ordering of race. So you can see in this picture here, there's a ruler, because if your arms or your nose doesn't fit the standard ethnocentric European model, that others you. And these were used as tools to go into other countries and take them over because they needed help from Western views, and also used in terms of migration to keep people out. So early photography has quite a dark history because it was used to tell a particular type of history about other people and also to control them. The real issue with these as well is that they hold people captive within them, but people also believe that photographs are true. So when we look at things, seeing is believing, because we're programmed. So our eyes are used to tell us what is there. So this photograph presents something that is read as real. So there's a whole issue with us believing the image, and even when we know it's false. So we know that when we see adverts for shampoo, that's not happening, okay? So years ago, people used to sell shampoo and they used to say, you'll get clean hair, kills nits. You're like, job done, shampoo. Now they sell an image, so it's because you're worth it. So you're going to use this shampoo and you're going to be amazing. That's what the image tells you. And we know that images are airbrushed and we know that they're not real, but they still have an influence. People still believe them and want to be them. So we know that when they Photoshop models' bodies, nobody can stand up if they're cut out like that. We know that. So people see the image and it filters in and people want to be that. And that's why you've got issues about people's self-worth and body image issues, because we still hang on to that truthfulness of the appearance of things. There's been a backlash against this work and this indignity of speaking for others. So post-imperialist work, people have tried to move away and represent people in a more authentic way. On the plus side of this work, John Collier was one of the people who really wanted to push anthropology in a different direction. So for Collier, seeing things was just as important as having written accounts. And when he did work, he took literally hundreds and thousands of images. So he didn't take one or two. He lived in communities for long times. In this project with the Vicos, there was a push to represent them as needing Western intervention and not able to run their communities themselves. But Collier didn't stick with the remit and did his own thing as a researcher on the project and presented a completely different community where he said they were happy and they were organised and they had fiestas and they weren't rich, but they didn't necessarily need to change their whole culture. And he was criticised for photographing people being happy when they lived in poverty, because you can't have both. So if you're photographing people in poverty, they should be sad all the time. And Collier was saying they're not. It's their lives, it's their everyday lives. People can be happy and poor. So you can use photographs in good ways. So even though it's got this legacy of issues with it. And the important thing about John Collier as well is that he later moved to not just taking photographs, but to photo elicitation. So Collier was the first person to use this in social sciences. So that he shared the photographs with other people on the team to see if they had the same interpretation, but shared them with the people in the photographs to see if he was getting the right meaning from them rather than giving his own meaning, which takes us into participatory projection. So that moves it into something more participatory. So when you do participatory work, you're looking to do work with, not on participants, and I think that's the sort of biggest thing about it. You're hoping to some extent it'll be participant-led, so participants will lead on what you're making. It's a way to move away from those sensationalised accounts that we were talking about earlier and engender a space for not sympathy but empathy. So a lot of work with photography and other visual methods often tries to evoke sympathy, but it's not about feeling sorry for communities, but thinking about what is it like for them. So emphasising, not sympathising. Even though, what I would say with most participatory methods, though, is that they're nearly always only partially participatory. So there's an idea that they're participatory, and we'll look at this more later. But if things are truly participatory, the participants will be involved from the beginning. So they'll be involved with the design of the research, and then the data gathering and data projection, and the dissemination. Nearly always participants are only involved in the middle. And most of my work, the participants are only involved in the middle. Because it's very hard to know if you're going to get a research grant. So to involve a lot of participants in designing something that's not going to happen is difficult. And then if you think about dissemination, not many of my participants would want to write a journal article. So if you're using traditional forms of dissemination, how do they come back in and do that with you? So it's not a bad thing, it's just the way things are. But I think you've got to be careful when people say their work's participatory. It's nearly only partially participatory, or participatory in some bits. So what you might find in a participatory project is that people give back the camera. So instead of the researcher owning the camera's given over to the participants. They choose what to photograph and why. And you see it in things like mapping, collages, drawing, Lego. I normally do sandboxing when I do this sort of workshop, but there were too many people and I can't carry them all from Cardiff. But if you do want to have a look at sandboxing later on one of the breaks, I've got a sandbox at the back on some journal articles and things like that that you can take home. So they're all at the back. So that's a sort of overview, and then hopefully more people will be inspired to use visual methods later.